are understandable and rational, and much of the parsha is dedicated to civil law, and much of the civil law of the Torah, not all of it, but much of the civil law of the Torah is discussed in this parsha, not fully. Some points are reiterated later in the third book and then in the fifth book, but there certainly is a good chunk of this civil law of the Torah comes from this parsha, from this portion called Mishpatim, the civil law. So as is our custom, we'll start with the parsha in a nutshell. There's going to be a lot of laws that we're going to cover in the nutshell, because that's the nature of the parsha. So here we go. We'll read the parsha, and then we will see if we can delve into some of the details. So Mishpatim in a nutshell. Following the revelation at Sinai, God legislates a series of laws that the people of Israel, for the people of Israel. These include the laws of indentured servants, the penalties for murder, kidnapping, assault, and theft, civil laws pertaining to redress of damages, the granting of loans and the responsibilities of the four guardians, and the rules governing the conduct of justice by courts of law. Also included are laws warning against mistreatment of foreigners, the observance of the seasonal festivals, and the agricultural gifts that are to be brought to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the prohibition against cooking meat with milk, and the mitzvah of prayer. Altogether, the parsha of Mishpatim contains 53 mitzvot, 23 imperative commandments, and 30 prohibitions. So we're talking about 613, 53 is a nice chunk. God promises to bring the people of Israel to the Holy Land and warns them against assuming the pagan ways of its current inhabitants. And finally, we get to a strange part of the parsha, which is the end. The people of Israel proclaim, "We will do and we will hear all that God commands us." Leaving Aaron and Hur in charge of the Israelite camp, Moses ascends Mount Sinai and remains there for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the Torah from God. The reason why I say this is strange is because it's not clear when this happened. According to Rashi, this really belongs in last week's parsha. This is the continuation of the giving of the Torah. So that's something we'll have to address. But in the meantime, even though in a nutshell, it looks like the civil law is only the first paragraph, but it's a good chunk of the parsha is dedicated to the civil law. So now we want to think about this and just to think about the word mishpatim and the concept of the civil law. It's actually quite surprising that this parsha, immediately after the giving of the Torah, what the Torah chooses to discuss is the civil law. Why is it surprising? Because what happens at Mount Sinai? At Mount Sinai, we get this great revelation. We're overwhelmed by the presence of God. The people tell Moshe, please, you speak to us. We can't hear God talk to us. We may die. And like Moshe says in Deuteronomy, God, there was this divine revelation. You have been shown to know that the Lord is the God, there's nothing else. And it's just an amazing experience. What's the next day? What's immediately after? Immediately after is the questions of civil law. Civil law, every society has a civil law. You don't need the laws of the giving of the Torah you don't need the Torah to be given. You don't need divine revelation to figure out a system of civil law. So it seems strange that amidst this right after the great peak of the giving of the Torah says, okay, this is what you do if my donkey if my ox scores your donkey. I mean, really, is that the first thing we need to know after the great spiritual revelation? And to make the question even greater is what I alluded to earlier, that the last reading of this parsha, the seventh reading, in the nutshell, it was the final two paragraphs, actually returns to the story of the giving of the Torah. So in other words, all this civil law is not really in place. The civil law is sandwiched between both stories that discuss the giving of the Torah. And the question becomes, why is the civil law so inspiring that you put it specifically sandwiched between the two stories of the giving of the Torah? So there are all kinds of interpretations and all kinds of angles. But I'm going to give you one angle. I think I said it in the past, but I want to say it again because it's like they say in Yiddish, it's geschmack. It's tasty. So if you think about the concept of Judaism. What is Judaism? What's the purpose of the religion? So often people think of religion as a service, you're serving God. But in reality, in Judaism, religion is, I don't want to call it religion, Judaism is an exercise of a relationship with God. And you cannot understand Judaism unless you think about the model of a relationship. And that's why the Hebrew word for mitzvah, commandment, in addition to the fact that the mitzvah means commandment, which connotes that we are accepting God's will, mitzvah also means together, tzavta, togetherness. And every mitzvah is really an opportunity to connect to God, to come close to God. So Judaism is about relationship with God. Now, every relationship, you need at least 3 dimensions. And I'm trying to write this up. So I sent it to my brother. He said, you wrote nice, but you need a better title. I said, okay, so what should the title be? Such an expert, what should the title be? He says, I don't know, but make sure it has the number 3 inside. People like numbers, the 3 best, the 10 best, 5. He said, it doesn't matter what your title is. Make sure you get the word 3 in. Okay, I'm listening to my brother. Every relationship needs 3 dimensions, and I'm going to explain. To allow the relationship to be meaningful and to grow over time and to take root and to expand. So the first thing you need to have certain shared interests, right? If you have a relationship with somebody and you have nothing in common, we don't like to talk about the same books, we don't like the same shows, we don't like the same music, we don't like the same food, okay? There's no relationship, right? There has to be something where the people feel that they can do something that they both enjoy, shared interests. Wonderful. And that's why when you feel like the relationship needs to be deepened, well, you do something that both of you enjoy. Wonderful. Okay, take a walk in the park, whatever it may be. And that's what all the dating apps try to figure out, how to find common interests. And today you got all the algorithms that bring people together based on common interests. Whether it works or not, I don't know, because I'm about to tell you that that's only one dimension. So even if the algorithms get it right and they figure out how to bring people together that have common interests, okay, there's more than that. So that's one element. The element is you find people that have common interests. You engage in activities that both of you enjoy. Wonderful. Okay, but that's not enough. You need some romance. So what's the next step? The next step is, look, you get to unique times, something like an anniversary. What is an anniversary? Anniversary is a time where you remember, even if right now I'm not feeling the intensity of the emotion, I'm not feeling the intense love right now, but you think about the anniversary comes about, you take out the wedding pictures, and you think about the time when the emotion and the relationship was very profound, and you reconnect to that energy. We say it in one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, in my opinion, is the verses in Jeremiah that we evoke on Rosh Hashanah in the Musaf. And what we say is, like Jeremiah, the Jewish people are about to go to exile, and the people are sinning, and God is upset. But God tells the people, I remember to you, Zacharti lach, I remember to you the kindness of your youth, the love of your bridal days when you followed me into the desert out of love. So in other words, even at that time, the relationship at the time of the exile, the relationship between God and the people was a little rocky, but God says, I still remember how we felt on the anniversary. I could still remember how we felt at our marriage, in our honeymoon. So that's anniversary. That's going back to feel the feelings that I felt in the past. It doesn't have to be on the anniversary. It could be on the anniversary. It could be you go to a place where you went in the past. You have some item that evokes the memory of the past. You hang up a wedding picture on in your house, whatever it may be. You're doing something to recall the past. Because over time, it's a challenge to keep that excitement of the original excitement, and you have to try to maintain it. Okay, so those are the first 2 elements. You have to engage in things where you have shared interests, and you want to commemorate those moments where the love was most intense. Wonderful. But that too is not enough. That's only 2 of the steps. And I told you that my brother said we need 3 in the title. No, I'm kidding. We need number 3. There's 3 dimensions. It's like a stool. A stool cannot stand with 2 legs. It needs 3 legs. What's the 3rd leg? Why isn't shared interests and remembering the love? Why isn't that enough? The reason why it's not enough is because relationship is more than a partnership of 2 people that is convenience. Well, I happen to like this, whatever, and you like it. So let's sit together and talk about it. It's much more than that. A relationship is about commitment. And you need to exercise that commitment. And that commitment is a very important part of the relationship that will actually solidify it and expand it. So how do you express the commitment? Not by doing the shared interest. Not I go to the restaurant that you like. I'm sorry, that both of us like. That's not commitment. Why am I here? I'm here because I enjoy the meat. The commitment is expressed specifically by doing things that I don't care for, but I know they're valuable to you. Right? Like some men, they don't really care for the roses, but they bring a rose. Why do you bring a rose? I don't need it. She needs it, or she needs it. She doesn't need it. The point here is I'm not doing it for myself. If I'm doing it for myself, then it's a wonderful thing. It's the first category. You're doing something, shared interest. You both appreciate it. You both like it. You both value it. Okay, it's wonderful. You need some of that. Maybe that's the first step, right? When you're when you're trying to create a relationship, you don't start with devotion. You start with, can I feel connected to somebody? Do we have some shared interest? But you can't remain with that. You have to go to all three dimensions if you want the relationship to take root and to expand and to lay roots and to mature. So we have all three. We have the category of things that we have shared interests. We have the idea of devotion, where I do things not because I want to do it. I'm not here because I want it. I'm here because you like it. I don't like it. I'm here for you. That's the devotion. And hopefully both parties each engage in all three. And then there's the moments that we talk about the idea that we go back to anniversaries. We go back to the time where the love was intense. Okay, wonderful. How does that, and so now here's the catch. Now the idea is that these three dimensions exist in our relationship with God as well. And these are the well-known three categories of commandments. So you have the commandments in our Torah portion. In other words, the bulk of the commandments in our Torah portion, which is what Mishpatim, civil law. These are laws that are logical. Anybody can understand them. Of course, they're a little bit different than the common law, and there's some brilliance, and there's some ideas where the Torah is different, and that makes it interesting. But the bottom line is, these are things that you don't need to be a great believer to follow. They make sense. In other words, we see eye to eye with God on these questions. Doesn't require commitment. Why are you following these laws? They're logical. Why are you going to the restaurant? I like it. Why are you watching this movie? Because I like it. Not because my spouse likes it, because I like it. She also happens to like it. Fine, wonderful. It's a win-win, right? Shared interest. They're wonderful. So Mishpatim, the civil law, shared interest. Wonderful. But then that's not enough. You also have the concept of testimonials, edut. What are testimonials? The holidays that we do to commemorate the past. But it's not just holidays. There are other things. For example, the tefillin also reminds us of the Exodus from Egypt. So the point here is we're doing things that remind us of the intense love of God to us and our love to him. That's the second category. What's the third category? Third category is chukim, decrees. The decree, why are we doing the decree? Why are we doing the mitzvah? Doesn't make sense. So why are we doing the mitzvah? Doesn't make sense. Because we have to, because we have no choice, maybe, but that's not the true idea. The true idea here is that is how those are the roses you buy for somebody when you don't care for roses. Now fill in the blank, and you may care for roses, you may buy something else. Whatever that thing that the other person likes and you don't necessarily care for, in some sense, that is a very important, maybe just as important part of the relationship, because that allows you to practice and feel and experience the commitment. And only then do you have all three rungs of the stool that will hold up this relationship. Now, that's why in this week's Torah portion, we have all three elements. Even though we're primarily talking about the Mishpatim, the civil law, which is the shared interest with our spouse, which is God. But if you look carefully, if you look back at the nutshell, you will see it also mentioned the holidays. Why are you mentioning the holidays? The holidays I mentioned so many times in the Torah. In the second book, in the third book, in the fourth book, and in the fifth book. It's reiterated so many times. So why are we saying it here? We're talking about civil law. Why are you mentioning holidays? Oh, because we're trying to say that one dimension, this parsha is teaching us that one-dimensional relationship is not going to last. You need all three dimensions. So the holidays is the anniversaries. And then, believe it or not, even a mitzvah that makes no sense, a mitzvah, a chok, a decree, snuggled its way into this parsha by mistake. The editor missed it. It's supposed to be civil law, but the editor missed it. What's that? It was in the nutshell. Not to mix milk and meat. Not to mix milk and meat is the it's one of the most quintessential decrees. It makes no sense. Why not? Usually something that's not kosher is because the substance is not kosher. Here, there are two substances that are kosher, and yet the combination is not kosher. It's considered a chok. It's considered a decree without a reason. So how did that make it into this parsha? Where was the editor? Or the editor was asleep. What happened? How did it slip in? Oh, because that's the point. The point is this parsha is coming in continuation to the giving up to the marriage, right? The moment of the giving of a Torah at Sinai is the marriage. That's what the Medrash says. V'yom chatunato. The day of the wedding is the day of the giving of the Torah. Now you have marriage. Now we have marriage advice. What's the marriage advice? Oh, you need all three. You need Mishpatim. You have to engage in shared interests. Those are the mitzvot where we see eye to eye with God. You have to have edut. Edut is the testimonials. Remembering the anniversaries. Celebrate the anniversaries. And again, anniversary is a recreation of that original energy, as we discussed many times. That Judaism does not really believe in anniversaries, because anniversary means I'm commemorating the past. But in Judaism, an anniversary is not a commemoration of the past, but it's recreation of that same energy. Tapping into that energy, it becomes available at an anniversary. And finally, we have to do that. We're happy to do the mitzvah that we don't understand, because in some ways, it's the greatest expression of love. You buy something for someone else, you go somewhere for someone else, not because you enjoy it, because they enjoy it. You need to have that element, not just because you have to, because that allows that muscle of commitment to be exercised in your soul, and nothing will deepen a relationship as much as the commitment. Again, we need all three dimensions, and that's why all three dimensions are in this week's parsha. That is the story in short. That is the introduction. Now we can start thinking about the parsha.
Who brings this down?
Who brings this down? That is a good question. In my notes, I heard it from my brother-in-law, who heard it from his father-in-law. That's the way to put it this way. In other words, these are long-standing concepts. The concepts that you need all three mitzvot, all the categories of mitzvot, is not the novelty, but the parable of a marriage is beautiful, and that I got from Mendel Kaplan, my brother-in-law, who got it from Moshe Nu. You may have seen him because he speaks some lectures on Chabad.org, and he's interesting to listen to. He loves talking about relationships. That's all he talks about. So that's where it trickled down to me.
Rabbi, you were talking about the marriage was at Sinai, but it wasn't when it was given, because it was given, that was just half the process. It was only when it was accepted that it was a complete process.
Right, but a marriage is not either. The marriage is a marriage the end of the beginning, right? Marriage is this the beginning. People think marriage is the end, marriage is the end of the relationship. No, marriage is the beginning. So marriage doesn't mean that it's that we don't have to grow. In marriage means that marriage is the starting point. It's like the bar mitzvah. Some people think the bar mitzvah is when you graduate from Jewish studies, and the reality is that bar mitzvah is really the initiation. It's not the graduation; it's the initiation. So same thing with marriage. Some people think, oh, marriage, it was nice. The dating process and period was fun, and then marriage, real life starts, and the romance and the excitement ends. But in reality, marriage is the beginning of the process. So the giving of a Torah doesn't mean we're far from perfect, and therefore marriage is going to be the obstacles. There's going to be challenges. There's going to be the even betrayal, which is the golden calf, which we'll read about in exactly 3 weeks. So we have a lot of work to do, right? The first year of marriage is complicated. But
so my question really was, at what point to consider the Jewish people, in quotes, married? Is it when when God gave it, when they said we will do and we will hear? Is it, just at what point, or is it in the entire process of giving, backsliding? Is it, how would you describe? You must be
Jewish. You're getting into the legalities. It's not so. My internet connection is unstable. That's not good. You're getting into the legalities, and it depends who you ask. From God's perspective, God shows up at the wedding, and He wants to express the love, and He wants the people to accept the marriage proposal. So from God's perspective, Sinai is the marriage. The Jewish people's perspective, it's not so simple. And I don't want to get into it right now, but if you get to the story of the golden calf, when Moses shatters the tablets, Moses is a good Jewish lawyer, and he says, sorry, God, she's not married. She never got the ketubah. She never got the marriage contract. So imagine you made a beautiful wedding, and you bought the flowers, and you got what do people do? You got the photographer, and you did everything, but you forgot to give your wife, the woman, the ketubah. Okay. So Moshe, the lawyer, comes back the next day and says, I'm sorry, it was a nice wedding. It was exciting. You had a good intention, but she never accepted the marriage document, and therefore she's not obligated. And therefore, on the breaking of the marriage, because the marriage didn't happen yet. Now, does God see it that way? I don't know. That's Moshe's defense. And that's why Moshe shatters the tablets. The point is, I'm not giving them this document because this document means they're married, and they're not married. They're not fully married. So I don't want to break the romance of the moment with the bringing in the lawyers and figuring out what exactly the marriage takes place. I remember the first time I officiated a wedding. So the bride's father was a lawyer. So the second the chuppah is over, he pulls me to the next room and he says, pulls out the New York State documents, and he says, we're signing right here. We're doing the marriage right now, legally right here. And I was like, this was funny to me. It looked like that he was afraid that the groom was going to back out. So he wanted to finalize everything in the legal sense. So yeah, so that's a good broad question. Certainly,
Yep.
Was the giving of the Torah. Whether or not he forgot.
How about, can't you?
Up a little. Can you hear me? Am I freezing up?
Off and on, you're freezing and unfreezing. I don't know if just me.
That's strange.
Me too.
Me too.
Oh yeah, I'm shaky.
Now you're good.
Okay, listen. Let me know if it's shaky, and then I'll switch to the phone, which may be a little better. Okay, we'll give it a shot. Okay, I think we have to start somewhere because there's so many laws to discuss and so many laws to elaborate upon. And some of these we discussed in the past. So if anybody has a specific idea that they want to cover, let me know. Otherwise, we start with the, we'll go in order, I guess. There's a lot to talk about. And of course, there are so many laws here. There's so many laws in.
Oops, sorry.
Sorry?
Why is the guardian section so important?
In what way is it important? Every mitzvah in the Torah is important. In one way, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say it's important?
I feel like a lot of emphasis is given to it, but maybe I'm wrong.
You mean in the space in the Torah, or the way people talk about it?
Yeah, the way people talk about it.
So it so happens to be that a lot of people, when they are introduced to Talmudic study, they study the laws of the guardians. The reason for that is because in some ways it's more interesting, it's more applicable than the laws of, for example, the goring ox. In other words, since the economy changes from the way the Torah describes the economy. So, for example, a lot of the laws of the damages in the Torah are related to an animal, my animal damaging your animal. Well, that was relevant before the automobile. And we went to Greenwich Avenue. I parked my donkey next to your donkey. And then I go into shop and I come out and there's a mess because the donkey's got into a fight. Can you imagine you park your Bentley in front of Richard's and you come out and your Bentley is fighting with somebody else's Porsche? You know, then you have to worry about it. So the economy changes. So it's hard to, if you're going to open up Baba Kama and start studying the Talmud of what to do with my ox or your ox, so it's a little harder to relate to. So it so happens to be that many people, focus on the laws that are easier to relate to in Talmud study. But in reality, as we will discuss, everything here is true on multiple dimensions, and it's true in the spiritual sense as well. And therefore, we study everything. Okay, let's give some clarity here. Just an overview. It's when you read it, it sounds like just a random list of laws, but the commentators, they comb through the details and they basically want to say that in reality, these mitzvot are an elaboration of the 10 Commandments. That's why last week's parsha, we have an elaboration of the 10 Commandments. And last week's parsha is the 10 Commandments. And this week's parsha is the details, the civil law and other laws that are all an elaboration of the Ten Commandments. And therefore, all these mitzvot could be attributed to one of the Ten Commandments. And some people go so far to say the order, it goes in order, but I don't want to get into too much detail. I just want to talk about 1 or 2 points of how this relates to the Ten Commandments, because the Ten Commandments are supposed to be the 10 most, I don't want to say the 10 most important, but I'll say 10 most general. So if they're general, they're going to include everything else. Okay, where does the civil law enter the Ten Commandments? So the easy answer is, it says, lo tigzol, not to steal. So civil law ultimately is if I owe you money for whatever reason, either because my property, either because I damage you, or because I borrow and I don't repay, or because my animal damages you. All these forms of civil law, civil obligation one to another could be included in do not steal. In other words, don't take money that belongs to somebody else, or do not withhold money that belongs to somebody else. But I saw another interpretation from more of a Kabbalistic approach, and I didn't get into it last week, but of course, if I ask you which of the 10 Commandments is the hardest to keep. So this is obviously a trick question because a lot of them are hard, but from one angle, the hardest mitzvah to keep is, of course, the 10th. Do not covet, right? Not to steal. Okay, even if I want to steal, I can hold myself back. Not to kill. Okay, I wanted to kill this morning, but I decided not to. I was able to withhold. But a feeling, do not covet, do not desire somebody else's possessions, that is very difficult to do. And it's a big question of how God could expect us not to covet what somebody else has. And anyway, there's multiple ways of explaining it, but ultimately what do not covet basically means is respect private property. Respect that what belongs to somebody else belongs to them, does not belong to you. So I can give you the theological interpretation, the Kabbalistic interpretation, but the bottom line is that under the 10th commandment, do not covet, it's respect someone else's possessions. And a lot of the mitzvot in this parsha do just that. Returning a lost object. Why do I have to return a lost object? I'm not stealing if I don't return a lost object. No. But if do not covet, more broadly, do not covet means respect the other person's possessions. And therefore, if he has a lost object, you return it. And that's how I'm just bringing an example where almost every mitzvah in this week's parsha could be is really an elaboration of a 10 Commandments. And once when we have time and we get off the Zoom, when we get in person, we could sit one day and try to figure out of attributing each mitzvah to which of the 10 Commandments. And whoever does that will get extra credit. Okay.
Rabbi, can I attempt to maybe offer the explanation why we start with the bondsman and the slavery, the theme is important? It's because in the commandments it says, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. So the theme of slavery, like the idea of slavery, has to be eradicated and totally revised.
Yeah. So let's talk about the first mitzvah, the mitzvah of slavery. That's where the parsha starts. And a lot of rabbis, like Elisa points out, many rabbis would much rather talk about lost objects and talk about slavery. 21st century, 20th century, nobody wants to hear about slavery. It's primitive, it's regressive. Nobody wants to hear it. So maybe that's why the rabbis jump right in and talk about the concept of the other mitzvot, of the 4 guardians. But we never shy away from what the Torah says. So we're going to address this head on, open up the Mishpatim Torah reading. And indeed, that's how it begins. These are the ordinances, chapter 1. These are the ordinances that you shall set before them. Should you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall work for 6 years. And in the 7th year, he shall go out to freedom without charge. And we have all the mitzvot, the details that are associated with the laws of the Jewish servant, or even maid servant in some cases, and that goes all the way down to verse 12, first 12 verses of the Torah. Okay, fine. Why are we beginning with this? So there's all kinds of interpretations. Vicky says this is really an extension of the first commandment. Because this is an extension of the first commandment, therefore it goes first. What is the first commandment? I am the Lord your God. What is the reasoning why the Torah says does not condone slavery? And even when it allows it, which we'll elaborate upon in a moment, the Torah is upset at the servant. For example, later we see The Torah says you leave at the 7th year. If you don't want to leave at the 7th year, there's this whole process where you could stay longer, but the Torah almost penalizes the servant. The Torah make you pierce a hole in the ear of the servant, which is supposed to be a deterrent that he should not want to be a slave. The Torah does not want slavery. Even if it allows it, as we'll discuss, it doesn't want it. Why not? So Rashi quotes the Talmud because the verse says, Kli b'nei Yisrael avadim, you're my servants. In other words, all people are servants to God. If we're servants to God, I can't be a servant to somebody else. So in other words, the idea of servitude is in some sense a violation of the first commandment. And that's why the first thing we have to ensure is the first thing we're going to discuss is, even though the servitude is necessary, as we will discuss, but you have to limit it because you have to uphold the first commandment. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that it's a reflection not just of the first commandment, but also of the fourth commandment. What's the fourth commandment? Shabbat. Where do you see Shabbat? So if you go back and you look at the mitzvah, it's right there. It's almost hard to ignore. Verse 2, should you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall work for 6 years, and in the 7th, he shall go out to freedom without charge. What does that remind you of? Shabbat. 6 days a week you work. On the 7th day, you go free. So the idea of Shabbat is also creating this time of freedom that in some sense was subjugated to the employer, was subjugated to work in the 6 days. And the 7th day, we achieve freedom. And in the cycle of a 7-year cycle, the servant also achieves freedom in the 7th day, in the 7th year. In the 7th year, yes. And mystically speaking, of course, everything here could be read on multiple levels. The Hasidic philosophy talks about that this is relevant to every person, even if you're not a slave, because I don't know who's not. Everybody is in some sense subjugated to something. But even if you're not, there is the spiritual slavery. What is the spiritual slavery? The spiritual slavery is involvement and being preoccupied and worried about material matters, right? I can have everything I need, but I'm worried, what am I going to get tomorrow? What happens if the stock market goes down? What happens if all of a sudden the stock I'm shorting, all of a sudden the Reddit decides to start lifting it up? You got all kinds of troubles to worry about. So 6 days I walk around and I'm enslaved in some sense. Why am I enslaved? I'm enslaved. I'm worried about material things. So the 7th year, which is a reflection of the 7th day, every Shabbat I have to be free. I have to stop worrying about the physical because I'm not a servant to the physical. I'm a servant to God. So that's how every law here could be read on multiple levels. I want to talk about one word about slavery because it's important. And people don't like to hear about slavery and they think slavery is bad, and it is. But what the Torah is saying is as follows. Who gets sold as a slave? There are two people who get sold as a slave. Number one, someone who steals and he can't repay. So it's not really sold as a slave. It's basically you're working for someone for 6 years. They just pay you up. They pay you up front. That's really what's happening here. And that's why there's regulation of what the person could do and what you can make the person do and how you have to treat the person. We'll get into that at a different time. The bottom line is that we're talking about something here where the person has stole and he can't repay. So basically, he's a thief. That's one person. Another person is someone who is so poor that he has no money for food, so he's gonna sell himself as a slave. Why? It's a good business model. You work for someone for 6 years. Not only will they pay you, but they also have to feed you and house you. Wonderful. It's a good job. Okay. So in other words, what is the institution of the slavery, quote unquote? It's not institution, it's not slavery, but what is it addressing? Who is it addressing? It's addressing the people the criminal and the homeless. Okay. Now let's see how modern society, which we're so enlightened, how we would address these problems and how the Torah addresses the problems. So what does the Torah basically tell you? What does modern society tell you? Someone commits a crime, you put him in prison. What do? You separate him from society. What happens when you separate him from society? You put him amongst other criminals. What happens? Well, we know at least 2/3 of people who are in prison return to prison within 3 years after they leave. Okay. What are the homeless people? Well, we're very benevolent. We create homeless shelters. Problem is that where to put the homeless shelters? And every time I turn on the radio, I hear about another controversy because they want to put a homeless shelter in a certain neighborhood and everybody's upset. So we're going to put all the homeless people together, put them in a shelter, move them away from the proper zip codes, and everybody will be happy. And of course, nothing happens. Nothing is solved. What does the Torah say? Torah says, if you want to solve a problem, if there's somebody who needs rehabilitation, either because they stole or because they're poor, you can't separate from the society. You have to bring them into somebody's home. They have to see what normal family life looks like. That's the meaning of the servant being sold for 6 years. Now, why would you purchase someone, quote unquote, for 6 years? Basically, it means you're paying in advance upfront for their work for 6 years, but you're actually burdening yourself because now you have to feed them and clothe them and house them. And the Talmud has all this regulation. You have to feed them the same food that you eat. They have to eat from your dish. In other words, they have to eat at your table. So basically, you're adopting somebody who needs help. That's what we're telling you here. And in that sense, that's the Torah is telling us you cannot solve social problems by isolating the problem and moving it away from the rest of society. If you want to solve problems, you have to take the individual and bring him into a healthy and productive place. And that's where the person hopefully can grow. And that's why the Torah is very nervous. The Torah is very nervous. What is the Torah nervous about the institution of slavery? The Torah is nervous that the slave won't want to stay. Right? He's being adopted by a beautiful family, beautiful home. They're feeding him. They're giving him everything he needs. He's working. It's wonderful. Everything is fine. Despite the fact that it's necessary for the person who needs that help, the Torah is very nervous that the person will get too comfortable. And even that say, no, ultimately we want liberty. Once you're rehabilitated, we don't want you staying in this family. Go make your own family. And that's why the Torah says, you better go out. You have to go out. And if you don't want to go, you really, really want to stay. Okay, we have a mechanism to stay till the Jubilee, but we're very upset. We don't want you to stay. But now, what's so interesting? What's so interesting is that the Torah expects the person to want to stay. So what does that tell you about the institution? This is not an institution that suppresses the person. To the contrary, this is an institution that will help the person rehabilitate. And it's going to be too much fun. The guy's not going to want to leave. Nevertheless, we want the person to leave. But all I'm trying to say is that what we take away from this story is that you cannot solve a problem by taking the person suffering, put him amongst other people who are suffering, and isolate them from the rest of society. You want to solve a problem, you need rehabilitation. Now I have my favorite story. And the reason I don't like to say stories because, first of all, I forget stories, and I don't know. I'm not good at stories. I forget all the stories. But this is one story that I heard first person. If I heard first person, I cannot ignore it. So our dear friend Steve Dubinsky, he told me like this. He told me the story. I think some of you may have been there when he said it. He said like this. He said that he used to be a New York Police Department detective, and he was working in the Bronx years and years ago. And one day they get a call. There's a big department store owned by a Jew, and somebody tried to steal. So they call the police. So Steve Dubinsky shows up. Steve shows up, and some other employee called the police and is holding this guy that tried to steal. And he says, so Steve asked the guy, "Why did you steal?" So the guy says, "I'm hungry. I need to steal." Okay, the guy's hungry. He needs to steal. So Steve goes to the owner of the store, Mr. Hecht, and he told him what happened. So Mr. Hecht says, "Oh, that's why he stole. Okay, I'm giving him a job." He gave him a job on the spot. And I heard this from Steve. Steve said that within 3 years, that guy was the manager of the store. That's the story. Now, I'm not saying you should bring someone in your house. You have to be careful. But what the attitude of that person, of that Mr. Hecht is, what that person is, you're not going to help somebody. You want to help somebody, you have to bring them into your life. And that's a beautiful story. And but that's really the model that the Torah is laying out. Now, of course, before you bring someone into your house, speak to your lawyers and speak to your, make sure it's safe, etc. But what I'm trying to say is that's the model what the Torah is doing here. It's not a model of oppression. It's not a model of slavery. To the contrary.
Rabbi, was this widespread? Because with people, the sabbatical year, the sabbatical is not counted from the time you started, but from it's external. So if you're sabbatical, the issue was next year is the sabbatical year. So there's no 6 years, it's 1 year.
So it depends. It depends. There was a different cycle for slavery unless I'm mistaken, for the slavery cycle, it was 7 years. It was 7 years. I have to check. I have to look into it. I should speak. I should.
If it was ever practically adopted.
Yes, it was a problem. It was a problem because sometimes the people, if you look at the Bible, it's this week's Haftorah, but we're not going to read it because we're going to read a different Haftorah. But the Haftorah for this week is a problem where the people people in Jerusalem did not want to release the slaves, the servants. So this is a problem. There is a temptation. If you're in a capitalistic society, there is a temptation to squeeze labor as much as you can. And this is not a problem that's only 2,000 years old. It's a problem till today.
Yeah,
right?
even in the story of Jeremiah, they released the Jews released the slaves, then they re-enslaved them.
Correct. So you see, it's a challenge, but I want to say it's not a challenge that was only in the ancient world. It's a challenge today. What the Torah is basically telling you, you have an employee, in some sense, they're enslaved to you, they're dependent on you, you pay them for their labor, but you also have to treat them as
ideal.
You have to treat them as a human being, and you have to treat them as, and therefore in the Talmudic law, there's all kinds of laws protecting the slavery, the liberty of the employee, certainly even a day laborer. There's this whole fascinating law. I don't have time to get it. I don't know if we should get into it right now, but the ability of the day laborer to quit in the middle of the day without losing the pay that he already earned, right? So lunchtime comes, I say, I want to go home. So the boss cannot penalize me and pay me nothing because I didn't stay till 6 p.m. No, I worked to 12, pay me half the day. There's a specific law that allows this. Why? The Talmud says, because we are slaves to God, not to the employer. In other words, we don't want to do anything to say that I now cannot go home because I want to protect the wages that I already invested. That's different to a day laborer and to a contractor. A contractor is different. You're not paying for the time. So if a contractor backs out, you don't have to pay the guy at all because he's not enslaved to you. He's a contractor. He's working on his own time. But the people who you're paying for their time, the Talmud gets very careful in regulating the fact that we have to give them as much freedom as possible because the freedom is a value. And like I said, this is not a problem of the ancient world. It's a problem of the modern world till today. And there's this tension between capitalism, which is the Torah values. Like I said, all this parsha really is predicated on the idea of private property. That's really what this parsha is doing. The parsha is establishing the religious responsibility to protect somebody else's values, monetary possessions. So we do believe in capitalism. We do believe in ownership. But on the other hand, we believe that the other side is we have to treat other people with dignity and freedom. And the bottom line is there's always going to be a tension between these two values. And we always try to seek the middle path because the extremes don't work. Okay, enough said about that. Okay, go ahead.
I think the stronger message today, for more relevant message for today, is the message for the employee, to the mindset of the employee, because we don't have the same institution of acquiring a slave, quote unquote, but we do have the concept of working for money, so not to be enslaved spiritually. That's the stronger message for today's world.
Yeah, I'm not going to sit and talk economics because I'm not an economic expert. But if you talk about the culture, and in America, it's very common for the boss to reach out to you on the weekend. In Europe, it's unheard of. Not that I want to live in Europe, but all I'm trying to say is that society has to balance the idea of commerce, the idea of capitalism, the idea of expanding wealth, and the freedom to choose to work for somebody, right? All these are freedoms. But on the other hand, there's the balance, and the balance is the 7th year you have to go free. That's the in the ancient world. What we're trying to say is you have to balance that with the idea that people are not just to be seen as productions of productivity, of creations of productivity, but there's a person and there's dignity, and the person has to have a spiritual life as well, etc. Okay. We're going to talk about this all day. We're not going to get anywhere. We have too much to talk about. So I want to continue a little bit. The only question is if we should go to law or to something more spiritual in the 7th reading. That's the only question. So okay, so we're going to go something a little more spiritual. And when it comes to the law, if anybody wants to study the details of the law, so we're going to eventually we'll get to the law on Tuesdays when we do Maimonides and we do the Talmud. Now we took the break for the JLI, but after the JLI, we'll go back to Talmud and Maimonides and civil law, and we'll be able to elaborate and go back to these verses, God willing, in good health. So I'm skipping to the end of the parsha. And it's probably one of the most mysterious verses in the Torah, but that's why it's fun. So here we go. We share the screen. We go to the 7th reading. And like I said, according to, whoops. Oh, I know what it's doing. Yeah. Because this week we actually, oh, interesting. This week we take out 3 Torah scrolls. Number 1 Torah scroll is for the regular Shabbat reading. A 2nd Torah scroll is for the fact that it's Rosh Chodesh. And the 3rd Torah scroll is because it's one of the first of the 4 special weeks that precede Passover. And we discussed this in the Haftarah yesterday, Wednesday, that in the biblical times, people would have to give a half shekel, a half coin every year for the offerings of the temple. So the week before Rosh Chodesh Adar, which is the last 11th month of the 12th month of the year, because the month of Passover is the first month. So, which is going to be, so the week before that, we read the portion in the Torah that commands everybody give a half coin. And happens to be, so this week we have 3 Torah scrolls. The Hasidim say, if there's 3 Torah scrolls, that means for Shabbos lunch, you have to have at least 3 kugels. Nope. I'm not sure if it was a joke, but that's what people would say. I don't know if they were serious. In any case, we're going to the end of the reading, which typically would be the 7th reading, but today it's only the 6th. Typically it's the 7th reading, but today it's the 6th, like I said, because the 7th reading becomes the reading of the Rosh Chodesh. In any case, Exodus chapter 24. And to Moses he said, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and prostrate yourselves from afar. The whole story here. Rashi says this story is really talking about the giving of the Torah. Why doesn't it say it last week is another story? Because we want to sandwich the civil law between both stories of the giving of the Torah. We can elaborate upon that if we have time. But I want to say, let's talk about the description of the revelation at Sinai. So I'm scrolling down. There's this whole ceremony where they take the blood and he pours it on the people and he says, this is the covenant. Exciting things are happening here. Okay, verse 10. Verse 10 is interesting. And they perceived the God of Israel. And beneath his feet was like the forming of a sapphire brick and like the appearance of the heavens for clarity. You have to describe what it means to see God, okay? So they saw God. What did they see? They see God's feet. Under his feet, there is brick sapphire. I have no idea what brick sapphire means. As far as I'm concerned, sapphire is a stone. It's a precious stone. It's not brick. But they saw a brick sapphire, but this brick sapphire is like the heavens for clarity. Okay, that I guess Tohar could be clarity, Tohar could be purity, and Tohar could also mean transparency. So you could say that the brick that they see, the sapphire brick that they see, is like the essence of heaven, ke'etzem. They say the appearance. It's like the essence of heaven for clarity and transparency. Very beautiful verse, except I have no idea what it's saying. Now, obviously, it's a metaphor because God doesn't have feet. And if he doesn't have feet, he doesn't have a stool for the feet. And therefore, they didn't see anything under his feet. Obviously, it's a metaphor. But the question is, what is it a metaphor? What is the metaphor teaching? What's the analog for this analogy? That's the question. So there are all kinds of interpretations. I'm going to give you Rashi's interpretation, and then I'm going to give you the Hasidic Kabbalistic interpretation. But again, it's an interesting verse, not just because we want to know what this metaphor is. This is how we describe the giving of the Torah. In other words, this is divine revelation. In other words, what's the most important experience that you feel at the giving of a Torah? What are you seeing? What's the takeaway? Okay, there's the laws, don't kill, don't steal. But what was the experience like to perceive God? Of course, you're not perceiving God physically because you can't see God because God has no image. But something here, whatever this means, is important to understanding what the revelation means. So the first thing we do is we play the famous trick. We click, and we see Rashi. So show Rashi's commentary. So now let's see what Rashi is going to help. Rashi is not Kabbalistic, at least not in this sense, in this case, but he'll give us some information to start with. So here's Rashi. Vayiru Elokei Yisrael, and they perceived the God of Israel, and beneath his feet was like a forming of a sapphire brick. Okay, now, so I'm going to skip the first Rashi because Rashi says it's a problem that they gazed at God. Let's skip that Rashi. Let's go to the next one. Like the forming of a sapphire brick. So I'll read the Rashi. Rashi is from the Medrash, and then we'll see what this really means and what it signifies. Like the forming of a sapphire brick. That was before him at the time of the bondage, to remember Israel's straits, i.e. that they were enslaved in the making of bricks. That comes from Leviticus Rabbah, from the Medrash Rabbah on Leviticus. Okay, what is Rashi telling you? Rashi's telling you they see God, and under his feet is what? There's a brick. What does a brick represent? If you're talking to the Jewish people who were enslaved for many years in Egypt, I guess the actual slavery was 80 something years. So we're talking about decades of work. What was their business? Well, what did they do as slaves? So the Torah tells you they made bricks. So when you say they saw God and they see there's a brick under God's feet, what does that mean? So Rashi says what it tells you is that the people sensed that the brick, which means their suffering, was right next to God, which means that that's what Rashi says. So what does it mean? It means that what they sensed is that their suffering, God did not ignore their suffering. Just because God didn't intervene until he did, it doesn't mean he didn't sense it. In other words, what they sense is that God is aware and knows of their suffering. Let's continue. And like the appearance of the heavens for clarity, like the essence of the sky for clarity, for transparency. So the Medrash continues, Rashi quotes, since they were finally redeemed, there was light and joy before him. In other words, what Rashi is saying is you have to read this clause into this verse as two separate clauses. In the beginning of verse 10, they perceived the God of Israel, and beneath his feet was like the forming of a sapphire brick. Says Rashi, that's referring to the time of slavery. They sense that when the Jewish people were enslaved, God had the brick before him. In other words, he had their suffering in his consciousness. And like the appearance of the heavens and of clarity refers to the joy, I guess, heavens and clarity and beauty, light. Light represents the joy that the Jewish people feel that God feels when the Jews were joyous and the Jews were redeemed. Okay.
Rabbi, there's another suggestion that it's transmuted from clay and water and stuff to something that is clarifying, that it's a transmutation of suffering into some very deep exchange, understanding.
Okay. You're taking a step further than me. Okay, I'll get to that. So let me highlight what you're saying. But let me first say what I think Rashi's saying. Rashi's saying, what's the most important thing you need to know about God? If God wants to reveal himself to the people, what does he have to show them? What's the awareness that they get? Right? We're talking, what do you mean God revealing himself to you? It means
I see what you were doing. You were making brick. I was there with you.
Yeah. Yes, but I'm just saying, if I want to feel, what does it mean to feel? What does God want to show me? What awareness does God want to give me? Not necessarily a philosophical one, right? God has to give me the awareness that I know that God is the creator. That's too philosophical. That's not necessarily moving for people. What the people need to hear is that God is close to them. And God feels their pain when they're sad, and God feels their joy when they're happy. That is what Rashi seems to be saying here. Rashi is saying, what is the great experience at Sinai? What does it mean to feel that God reveals himself to you? It means that you feel that when you suffer, God is aware of it, and he knows about it. He doesn't ignore you. And it's not that he's ignoring you. And when you're happy, God is joyous. In other words, God is not abstract, removed, like some of the philosophers thought, but God is empathetic. That's what Rashi is saying. Now, Jill is saying even more that the joy brings, that the suffering leads to joy. We'll leave that for another time because we're running against the clock. I'm going to say one more point, and this is the Kabbalistic point from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, when you hear brick, what do you hear? The brick and sapphire. The sapphire brick is the biggest contradiction ever. Why? Because in the Torah, you have to understand that when you say brick, to us, it has one connotation. But if you look in the Torah, what does brick connote? Brick, as opposed to stone, means natural versus man-made. If you look at every appearance of brick in the Torah, like starting with the first one, the Tower of Babel, the people of Babylon create a modern invention. What's the modern invention? They build a building in Babylonia. They build a building in Iraq. How do you build a building in Iraq? Usually the way you build a building is stone. But to have stone, you need mountains. But Babylonia is a valley. There are no mountains. There's no quarry. You can't get stone. So you can build a hut, but how can you build a tower if you have no stone? So the big innovation in the book of Genesis is the people of the Tower of Babylon. They say, you know what? They get together and they say, Havanil benal, let us form bricks. And bricks is this unbelievable invention. You take earth, It's not stone, but it's man-made. You put it into the fire, and you know what? You can make a product that's just as good as the stone. And the people create technology that's just as good as nature. That's what stone means in the Torah. That's what brick means. Brick means man-made. Now, you say stone and sapphire. I'm sorry, sapphire brick. So brick is man-made, and sapphire, of course, comes from nature. Now, what is brick? Brick is earth. Brick is earth. What is a brick? A brick is earth. You take sand, you put it in the fire, you have a brick. So it says the brick was like the clarity and the transparency of heaven. Brick and heaven are the two extremes. You cannot find anything more extreme than brick, which is earth, and heaven, which is clear, which is transparent, which is intangible. So what's happening here? So this is the beauty of the Hasidic interpretation. Says the Hasidic interpretation, what did the people experience? The people experienced at Sinai. What's Judaism? Judaism is not about becoming all spiritual. Judaism is about taking the brick, which is earth, and making the earth as clear, as transparent as the heaven. In other words, you're making the physical spiritual. In other words, the whole idea of Judaism is you're taking every mitzvah, which is essentially every mitzvah that you'll do, that every mitzvah the Torah will tell us from Sinai on, essentially is taking a brick and making it as pure as the heaven. Why? You're taking something earthly, something physical, and using it to advance spirituality. And that's why, if you have to experience, what did the Jewish people see? What did they understand? What did they realize at the moment of Sinai? They realized that a brick could become as pure and as transparent as the heaven. And everything we do every day, we're making bricks and making the bricks as transparent as heaven, because we're not escaping to heaven. In fact, we're transforming the earth into heaven. And that's what Judaism is all about. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining. And have a wonderful day as you go about your day, taking earth and making it brick, and making the brick like sapphire, and making the sapphire as pure as the heaven. That's what started at Sinai, and we continue that every single day, all day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.